lot to get through today. We are continuing in our series called In the End, where we're exploring the last two chapters of the book of Revelation. And we're doing this because we spent so much time the first two chapters of Genesis. We see how the story begins, that it's helpful now for us to see how the story of the Bible ends so that we can live in light of that. But I don't know if this resonates with you at all. You know, sometimes you know where you used to be and you know where you're going, but you feel stuck in the middle, right? You're like you're not where you used to be, but you're not where you're going. The word for that is called a liminal space. You're like in the in-between. And some of us know what it's like to be in between when it comes to our career, when it comes to our marriage, when it comes to our kids. And when we get in those places, we feel stuck. For me, several years ago, my wife and I, we decided that instead of getting each other Christmas gifts, that once a year we're going to take about a 4-day trip away, just the two of us, no kids. Which if you can pull this off, there's nothing better for your marriage, okay? Because listen, kids don't cause problems in your marriage, but they do magnify the ones that were already there. And we noticed we would get away and within 12 hours, we'd be like, I forgot how fun you are, right? We got married for a reason. And so we plan these trips usually in February-ish. And so one year, my wife said, hey, we're booking this trip. We're going to come home on this Sunday. Is that okay with you? And I said, yes. And she said, well, it is Super Bowl Sunday. Are you sure you want me to book this? Now, frame of reference, I grew up in Ohio. I'm a Cincinnati Bengals fan. Up to this point, the Bengals had only been to the Super Bowl one time in my life. That was 1989. They are widely considered one of, if not the most inept franchise in all the NFL. So I never expect my team to be in the Super Bowl. So yes, book the trip. Let's make it happen. And sure enough, they go on a miracle run and they make it to the Super Bowl. So I'm like, okay, I can't miss the Super Bowl because I'm on a plane. What can I do? Well, the airline had one flight that was going to leave earlier in the day, but it was going to leave at 7 a.m. So I moved my ticket to this 7 a.m. flight. Now, we were with friends, so my wife said, I'm going to stay and sleep in. I will meet you at home. So let's see, for you travelers, if my flight leaves at 7 a.m., what time am I supposed to be at the airport roughly? 5, right? Well, the hotel we're staying at provides transportation, but they want to make sure they get you there in plenty of time. So they tell me we're going to leave the hotel at 3 a.m. to get you to the airport on time. Now, if you've ever spent any time with me, I am a child, and I decided it's my last night. Let's stay out as late as possible. So I go to bed at midnight, and I have to be in the shuttle at 3 a.m. We get to the airport, we get everything checked in. I am now sitting at a gate at 4 a.m. for 3 more hours to get on my flight. I have nothing with me. I'm tired. Anybody ever try to sleep at an airport gate? It is not the most comfortable thing in the world. And so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I could be back at the hotel still sleeping. And eventually, I'm going to be back in my own home and I can rest in my own bed. But right now, I'm stuck here and all I can do is wait. I think that's how a lot of us feel in life sometimes. We're stuck in the in-between. We're wandering in the wilderness. And when we are in that liminal space, the biggest temptation we face is the temptation of trust. Will we trust God to do what he's going to do in the wilderness, or will we try to take control for ourselves? That is the situation facing the Christians that are receiving the letter of Revelation. So we've talked about before, these are first century Christians who have trusted in Jesus. They believe that he defeated sin and death, and so certainly things would get better, right? Except that now they're experiencing a pretty severe form of persecution. The Roman Emperor Domitian is in power, and he's actually they're worried about being arrested, imprisoned, and even put to death. But there's some really tangible things that come along with this persecution. Namely, Domitian sets up temples to himself in all the major cities. And if you're going to practice in the marketplace, if you're going to buy or sell things, you first have to go into the temple. You have to make a sacrifice to Caesar and proclaim that Caesar is Lord. And then you can work in the marketplace. So this is a problem for Christians because there is only one Lord and his name is Jesus, right? So they can be faithful to Jesus, or they can like compromise and say Caesar is Lord so that they can make a living for themselves. By the way, a little side note, in Revelation, the mark of the beast, when it talks about taking the mark to partake in economic activities, that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about credit card companies putting microchips in your hand to make purchases, okay? It's talking about this stuff right here. So in this in-between, like, hey, we know Jesus defeated sin and death. We know that he's going to make all things new, but we're stuck in this in-between here. What do? Do we take control for ourselves? Like, what if we just say Caesar is Lord, but we don't mean it because I've got to provide for my family? What if I just make my relationship with Jesus about my eternal destination? I don't really have to let it impact how I live here and now. Are we tempted to trust Jesus or take control? That's the setting for what we're going to read this morning in Revelation chapter 21. Now, we're going to start in verse 3 today. And for our astute Bible students here, you're like, Matt, we read some of these verses last week. And yes, we did. We're going to read back through because there's so much that we did not get to last week. I promise starting next week, the pace will pick up pretty significantly. But I wanted to revisit a few verses because remember, they're in the in-between. And so God is giving John this vision of here's where it's all culminating so you know what everything is moving towards. It's to offer them hope in this time of crisis. Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. The vision John has, he says this, "Then I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." So in order to offer encouragement to these people who are stuck in this in-between place, he says, hey, where this is all culminating is God is going to dwell with his people. And the word dwell here, this was written in Greek, is actually the same word for tabernacle. He's going to tabernacle with his people. Now, if you've been tracking with us, this is fascinating. Because in Genesis 1 and 2, we said that the creation story is described as the creation of a temple where God is going to fill all of creation to be with his people. Now, of course, when Adam and Eve decide they're going to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, sin and death are unleashed into the world, and that goes out the window. So the story starts with God dwelling with creation like a temple. The story ends with God dwelling with all creation in the temple. But how many of us know sometimes we look around and it feels like we're living in a God-forsaken place? Like, is God in this anywhere? And certainly that would be the temptation to think, but God's plan was not just, hey, this is how it starts, this is how it ends, I'll see you when we get there. God wanted to be with his people from the very beginning. So we actually see this in the book of Exodus. Now, I'm going to assume you've watched the movie The Prince of Egypt or The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, so I'm just going to summarize here really quick. The book of Exodus begins with the Jewish people enslaved in Egypt. They're asking for God to save them, so he sends Moses. Moses confronts Pharaoh. God sends a series of plagues. Finally, Pharaoh says, you guys can leave. They leave Egypt. They get to the Red Sea. You know the whole deal. The sea parts. The Israelites pass through. The waters come crashing down on Pharaoh's armies behind them. Now, they are no longer enslaved in Egypt, but they're going to wander 40 years in the wilderness before they get to the land promised to their forefather Abraham. Talk about a liminal space, an in-between space. We're not enslaved, but we're not where we're going. So what do we need in between? Well, in the second half of the book of Exodus, we get these instructions where God wants them to build a house for him to be with his people. This house is the tabernacle. In fact, the book of Exodus ends in Exodus chapter 40, verse 34 and 35. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So the book of Exodus ends. We're about to see this 40-year wandering journey, but it ends with God taking up residence with his people. See, God doesn't wait for them at the destination. He journeys with them through the wilderness. Like, we have to remember, sometimes when we're in that in-between place, it's tempting to feel like we're all alone, that God has forgotten us, but he is with us. His presence will walk us through the wilderness. He wants to be with his people. Now, when he's with his people, what is he going to do? Let's flip back to Revelation 21, starting in verse 5. It says, the one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. he also said, lost my spot there. The one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. He also said, write, because these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the springs of the water of life. So for those who are around the presence of God, the ones who are thirsty will receive water from the waters of life. Now, let's go back to Exodus. If you are a people wandering in the desert for 40 years, what is one very important resource that you are going to need access to? Water, right? That's the audience participation portion. Is going to need access to water. But I don't know if you've ever been in desert areas before. Water is not readily available. So how are they going to get this water? This is the conundrum we see in Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, verse 1. The entire Israelite community left the wilderness of Sin, moving from one place to the next according to the Lord's command. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So the people complained to Moses, give us water to drink. Why are you complaining to me? Moses replied to them. Why are you testing the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you ever bring us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So they're in the wilderness and they get thirsty. Anybody here ever been hangry before? Anybody married to somebody who gets hangry? You don't have to raise your hands, right? Like what happens? People get thirsty, they get hungry, they get cranky. And here they're frustrated because they're in the desert. They do not have access to water. And what do they say? They say, we were better off in Egypt. Why did you bring us out of Egypt just to die here in the desert? Now, let's be honest for a moment. We're not, hopefully you're not dying of hunger right now. You're not dying of thirst. Were they better off in Egypt? No, they weren't better off as slaves. But when we get stuck in that in-between, sometimes we just want to go back to what we used to know. We want to go back to the things that we were comfortable with before, even though it wasn't the best for us. In fact, haven't you ever noticed that like so much of life is people wanting to get back to the good old days? Let's get this nation back to what it used to be. Let's get the church back to Acts chapter 2 and what it's supposed to be like. Let's get back to the good old days. Listen, the good old days weren't as good as we remember them being. Like, do you really want to go back to the days before we had indoor plumbing or air conditioning? Do we really want to go back to the days of like dial-up internet? Whew, oh man, that's how comfortable of a life I have. That's my biggest fear, dial-up internet. No, we think we want to go back to something, but listen, when we get in that in-between, oftentimes we start grumbling about going back when God wants to move us forward. And so here they're looking in the wrong direction, but Moses takes this concern to God. Let's pick up in the next verse. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? In a little while they will stone me. The Lord answered Moses, go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take the staff you struck the Nile with in your hand and go. I'm going to stand there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and the people will drink. Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. So Moses goes to God. God says, all right, I want you to take that staff, the same one that I used to perform the plagues in Egypt. I want you to take that staff, hit the rock, and water will come out of it. And that's exactly what happens. Now, Bible reading 101. This is not instructions on how to get water from rocks, okay? So if you go around hitting rocks with sticks, water's not going to come out. What is this about? This isn't about hydration. This is about, will we trust God to provide for us even when it doesn't make sense? It doesn't make sense that hitting a rock with a stick is going to bring water, but will I trust God to do that and to trust that he will provide? By the way, he provided what they needed. He didn't necessarily provide everything they wanted, right? Like wine didn't come out of the rock. Sweet tea didn't come out of the rock. Coke Zero didn't come out. It was water. It was what they needed. He will provide, but he's going to provide it by saying, hey, trust me to do this. So actually what the water then becomes is it's a visible representation of God's invisible presence with his people. Right? There are moments where we can't feel God's presence. His presence seems invisible or mysterious to us, but he will give us visible reminders that he is at work. You know, oftentimes as a pastor, people will come to me and say, hey, can you pray for my kids? Can you pray for my parents? Can you pray for my friends? And I do, and then usually the end of my prayer is, and will you also give the person who asked for this prayer some visible reminders that you are at work in this person's life, in small ways or big ways, because we need that visible representation of the invisible presence of God. In fact, this idea of this water gets kind of baked into the way that the Jewish people operated each and every day throughout history. You know, my wife and I were hosting Thanksgiving this year for all of our families, so we're excited. It's going to be great. We started talking about different traditions that we had growing up, and she shared this thought with me that I thought was interesting, that traditions kind of become the framework for how our memories work. Right? It's not that every time you get together for Thanksgiving, you have like some core memory, but when you do things over and over and over again, it becomes part of your family's history. It informs who you are. And this is how the Jewish people approach their faith. They have several different festivals and feasts that they didn't just do because they needed to do some kind of liturgy. It's because they actually reenacted the story of their people. So for example, one of the festivals that they celebrated was called the Festival of Tabernacles. So if we flash forward, the Jewish people settle into the Promised Land, then every year during this festival, for 7 days, the people would live in these makeshift tents to remember how their forefathers had wandered in the wilderness. And then every day during this celebration, the priests would get together in a processional. They would march to the pool of Siloam. They had a big gold bucket that they would fill up with water from the pool, and they would march back into the temple. All the while, the Jewish people are shouting shouts of praise from Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3, about the water of salvation. And then the priest would get in front of everybody, and he would pour out water and wine in the temple. The water to pray for rain for the crops, wine representing God's blessing, and then trusting that one day his spirit, like that water, will be poured out for all people. This is what Isaiah and Ezekiel talk about in their prophecies. Now, this goes on for 7 days. Now, what's interesting is, like, we're not here because we need Jewish history class. We have to understand that because Jesus was Jewish, which meant that Jesus grew up celebrating these feasts and festivals every single year. And the last time he celebrates the Festival of Tabernacles is described in John chapter 7, verse 37. It says, on the last and most important day of the festival, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. The one who believes in me, as the scripture has said, will have streams of living water flow from deep within him. He said this about the Spirit. Those who believed in Jesus were going to receive the Spirit, for the Spirit had not yet been given because Jesus had not yet been glorified. So let's paint the picture. All of Israel's gathered here, and they've been living in tents for 7 days. They get up on the morning of that last day. Do you think they're excited to go back home to their own bed, to be done living in the tents? And so you get the priests get up, the processional goes down to the pool of Siloam, they fill their bucket up with water, they walk back into the temple, there's shouts of praise, and then everything hushes. They're ready for the priest to pour out the water one last time. It's probably so quiet you could hear a pin drop. And then Jesus stands up in front of everybody and says, hey, this whole thing, yeah, that's about me. Like, do you see how, shocking this would have been? Do you see how, offensive that this would have been to people, that this thing you've been looking forward for centuries, this is actually all about me? We all know people who want to make everything about themselves. Jesus does this in the best way possible here. This is about me. And guess what? Anyone who believes in me, you will have rivers of life that flow from within you. He's saying the Spirit is going to take up residence not in a temple, not in a tabernacle, but in your life. And that every wilderness you walk through, the Spirit will be with you. The Spirit will be working in your life and through your life. What we have in the Spirit is a glimpse of what we have coming in the future when His Spirit is poured out, not just to a select group of people, but for all creation to enjoy. Are we tracking so far? Now he continues this line of thinking in Revelation 21 when we get to verse 7. He says, the one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But the cowards, faithless, detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. All right, so who is going to have access to this living water? Well, the conquerors are going to have access to it. But the cowards, they're going to suffer judgment as death. John here is comparing and contrasting conquerors and cowards. Now, when I hear conquerors and cowards, certain images come to my mind. Like, I think a conqueror is someone who's going to step up and take control of things, and we're going to take new ground, and we're going to defeat the enemy. That's what a conqueror does. And a coward is someone who's over in the corner, and they're weak, and they're not speaking up. They're not taking a stand. That's what a coward is. And those can certainly be ways we use those words, but that's not how John is using them here. The conqueror isn't the one who's taking new ground. The conqueror is the one who remains faithful to Jesus. The coward is the one who fails the temptation of trust and decides to take matters into their own hands. I want to share a story from Numbers chapter 20, if we can go ahead and fire up those verses. The entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and they settled in Kadesh. Miriam died and was buried there. There was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us up from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grains, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Now, I don't know about you, but this story sounds strangely familiar to one we read earlier. They're in the wilderness of Zin. They're thirsty, and they start complaining and wishing they could go back to the way things used to be. Right? It's like almost like sometimes we don't learn our lesson the first time. And so they're complaining. What does Moses do? He does the same thing he did before. He turns to God. In the very next verse, it says that Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock." Now, here's where we get the first big difference between the two stories. In the first story, they're in the wilderness. They're complaining of thirst. They want to go back. Moses goes to God, and God says, "Take your staff, go to the rock, and do what? Hit it." All right? In this story, they're in the wilderness. They're complaining of thirst. Moses goes to God. God says, "Take your staff and do what? Speak to the rock." Big difference here. What happens in the very next verse? So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock for you?" Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Moses was told this second time to do what to the rock? What did Moses actually do to the rock? He hit it. Again, this is not stories about getting water from rocks. This is stories about, do we trust God to do things his way? Now, here's the really complicated piece. He disobeyed God, and what happened? Water came from the rock. So from a very pragmatic standpoint, Moses could say, "What's the big deal, God? We needed water. You gave us water. Does it matter what way I did it?" And for God, it definitely matters, because now he's going to have to punish Moses by telling him, "You will not enter the promised land because you did not trust me." And by the way, I think this is such an important point for us to understand in our current day and age. I know that as a pastor and a nerd, like, my social media algorithms aren't like most normal people's. Okay, so maybe this doesn't resonate, but for me it does. Earlier this week, there was a bit of a dust-up because there's a prominent pastor who essentially made the point. He said, we need to elect conservatives into office because conservative policies lead to the flourishing of the gospel, and liberal policies are an enemy of the gospel. Now, I disagree with this on two counts, because it does not depend on elected officials whether or not the gospel will advance. Okay, there is no such thing as a threat to the gospel. In Revelation 20, we get this big battle scene where the beast and all his minions are on one side and Jesus and all his followers are on the other side. And if you're reading it, you're thinking okay, this is like that moment in Avengers Endgame where everybody shows up and they're going to go to war, but the battle's over before it starts. It just is over with a word from Jesus. And his followers didn't have to do anything. Like, Jesus will advance his kingdom no matter what. In fact, you could argue that sometimes when the policies are the harshest is when the gospel grows the most. For example, in communist China, the gospel flourishes so much despite the persecution because God has a history of doing unexpected things through unexpected people. So on one count, listen, there's no such thing as a threat to the gospel. But on the other hand, the implication there is sometimes we're going to have to elect people who do non-Jesus-y things so that we can get Jesus-y results. Right? The ends justify the means. And this absolutely, unequivocally cannot be how we approach our political viewpoints. Because for Jesus, right? For Moses, we got the water. What does it matter? But for Jesus, it's, do you trust me to do things my way? Do you trust that the ends don't justify the means, that God will handle the ends if we are faithful? We talk all the time, faithfulness versus effectiveness. We live in a culture that prioritizes effectiveness, whatever gets the job done. And yet we follow a God who prioritizes faithfulness. Well, we do it the way he's asked him to do, even when it doesn't make sense. Even when we're supposed to speak to a rock, do we want to hit it instead? So if we do that, that's the conqueror-coward divide. The coward takes control. The coward does what is effective. The conqueror is the one who is faithful, even when it doesn't make sense. I had one more point that I really don't have time to get into, but in verse 5, he says he's making everything new, right? That's the Spirit is going to be with us in the wilderness, but the Spirit is also going to make everything new in the midst of the wilderness season. If you're in this room, you are a part of everything. Jesus has an agenda for your life to remake you into the image he created you to be. Now, is that kind of personal change, is that easy? No, right? If you want to lose weight, is that I wish losing weight and getting muscles and getting financially in order was easy. Those are hard things to do because it requires some significant change in our lives. But if we're going to change, the change happens in the wilderness. In fact, when I was in elementary school, I don't know if everybody did this, but one of the units we had, there was a terrarium, and they put caterpillars in there. And so every day we would draw pictures, and we would write what the caterpillars were doing. And then pretty soon they went into their cocoon, which I think technically the term is chrysalis, okay? So don't come at me with science stuff, all right? But they go in there, and we're still doing it every day. We're just writing down, drawing another chrysalis. Here it is again. Nothing's happening. Nothing's changing. And then one day we come in, and there's a butterfly that is now in the terrarium where the caterpillar used to be. It's a monarch butterfly. And I remember we released them. I grew up in Ohio. They said they migrate down to Mexico. I would like to think that our butterfly made it all the way to Mexico and not that a bird got it 10 minutes after we released it. Okay, either one is true, could be true, but I'm choosing to believe the best part. Now, what I later came to learn is that you look at that cocoon, it looks like nothing's happening, but actually a lot's happening. You know what happens to a caterpillar in the cocoon? It liquefies. And after it liquefies, it's reshaped into a butterfly. That sounds to me like a very unpleasant experience. But there are times when we're in the wilderness and outwardly it looks like nothing changes. Your circumstances are the same. Our prayers haven't been answered. It feels like we're stuck. And yet inwardly, doesn't it feel like we're falling apart? We're liquefying. Like God's cutting out some parts of us. It's difficult. It's not easy. And yet the hope is that the Spirit continues the work of change and transformation so that we become the people he's called us to be. But we do not get to become the people he's creating without the process of wandering through the wilderness. But what does it mean then to allow the presence of God to do the work in the wilderness? How do we do that? Because I'm sure there's some of us here today, we know exactly what it feels like to feel stuck, to feel like we can't move forward, that things aren't getting any better. What do? A couple of thoughts. The first one is that we have to sit in his presence. Right? You have to actually spend time in the presence of Jesus. In fact, I can't think of anything more important that we rearranged the whole way we approach Sunday mornings because I want you, if nothing else, to spend time with Jesus. Or we do communion every week. I didn't grow up doing that. But we do that because I think sometimes it seems like, the music is kind of the opening act for the teaching, and the teaching's at the center. But no. Everything here is an opening act for the time you have with Jesus. We live in a day and age where at the click of a button on your phone, you have access to some of the best teaching in the world. Like, you did not come to church today because you need a really good message from me, right? Like, the messages here are, I think the kids call them mid, all right? Like, they're not awful, they're not life-changing, but that moment you spend with Jesus, that is life-changing. So you don't need another message, you need a moment with Jesus. You don't need another sermon, you need time with your Savior. And so everything we do is structured out of that way. Interesting to note, we forget sometimes Sunday is not the last day of the weekend. It's the first day of the week. And there's so much we can say, like, you don't work all week just so you can make it to the weekend and rest. No, we actually start from a place of rest so that we can do what God has called us to do in the coming week. And what my hope is that we start the week by spending a moment with Jesus, and that becomes the pattern through which we live every single day this coming week. What does it look like to sit in his presence? I mean, could we spend just a few moments in prayer before our day begins? Could, instead of picking up our phone first thing in the morning and checking email and social media, could we pick up our Bibles and spend time reading through Jesus' words? What if we spent 3 minutes in the morning just in silence and solitude, not sitting there thinking about our to-do list or all the errands we have to run, but just sitting there and thinking about Jesus? What if when we got in the car, instead of turning on a podcast, we put on worship music and let that just become a moment of worship? There's so many ways we can sit in his presence. But I think like we have to be intentional about it. Right? Like, you ever hear that phrase, hope is not a strategy? If you hope to sit in his presence, but you don't have a plan for it, it will not happen. We have to sit in his presence. The second thing, stay in his presence. Right? Like, I could have just said sit with his presence, like, for every single point. Like, that's what we need. But stay there. Because too often what the temptation can be is I'm going to spend 5 minutes with Jesus in the morning and hope that's enough to get me through the rest of the day. If I told you that I wanted to get healthy, so I'm going to eat a healthy breakfast, but I'm going to hit up McDonald's for lunch every day and my favorite Mexican restaurant for dinner every day, is that going to do much? No, because the one thing doesn't outweigh the rest. Like, 5 minutes with Jesus is a great start, but it cannot be the whole sum total. Like, we live in a day and age now where, you know, if I leave a meeting, I'll pick up the phone, I'll call my wife, or if she's out and about, she might text me to see how things are going. Like, we're constantly in communication with the people that we love. Are you constantly in communication with Jesus? Are you constantly redeeming that time? Listen, you might have to start really simple with that few moments in the morning, but what are ways you can stay in his presence throughout the day? The third thing is that we need to share his presence. And sharing his presence might be as simple as just like sharing what God has done in your life. It might be like sharing the gospel with somebody. But I think a lot of times sharing the presence, listen, if the Spirit resides within us and we move around, aren't we just little tabernacles everywhere we go? Aren't we the people who can show what a life of peace looks like in a world of chaos and turmoil? What a life of generosity looks like in a world of selfishness and consumerism? What a life of love looks like in a world that wants us to hate people who are different than us? Like, simply by existing as people who are constantly in the presence of Jesus, we bear witness to who he is and what he's done. I have one more point that I want to make, but I want to leave time for Q&A like we do every week. So just remember, questions, not comments, relatively quick and to the point and relevant to what we're talking about today. So did we get any text-in questions? Let's just throw the one up from first service, if we can. It's what we call a smooth transition in the biz. It may not be up there. I can tell you what it was. The question was essentially, why did God wait to provide water for the people in the desert until they complained and asked about it? And kind of my initial thoughts here, you take this for what it's worth. You know, Scripture tells us we don't have because we don't ask. And I think that there are times where God will allow us to reach the end of our rope trying to do things our own way, and all he's waiting for is for us to simply ask for help. Like, I know, like, for me, like, I constantly am reminding myself, let prayer be my first response, not my last resort. Let me turn to him before things fall apart. Like I said, it is so easy to follow Jesus in the valleys in life, right? When you hit rock bottom and there's nowhere else to turn, of course you're turning to Jesus because you can't do it. It is a lot harder to follow Jesus in the mountaintop of prosperity. When you have the stuff you need, when you feel like you can get what you want, that's when we get back into the temptation of trust. Will we turn to God and trust him first, Or will we just spin our wheels until we reach rock bottom and can't do it anymore? And so whoever sent that in first service, fantastic question. I love that one. But we're going to continue this morning with a time of communion like we do every week. So we have our communion stations around the room. On one half of the table, we have the crackers and juice, the body and blood of Jesus. On the other half, you can write a prayer to God and put it in the prayer jar or light a candle. But again, everything this morning is built up for this moment right here. And so in this moment with Jesus, a couple of questions to consider. The first one is this: where am I being called to trust? Like, God is calling you to trust him in some area. Is he calling you to trust him with your marriage? Is he calling you to trust him with your kids, with your career, with your finances, with your goals and ambitions and dreams? Where is he calling you to trust him rather than take control yourself? The second question is, how can I sit in his presence? Again, hope's not a strategy. Like, at least take a moment today to say, here's my game plan for tomorrow morning, right? Like I'm going to get up and I'm going to spend time in prayer. I'm going to turn on some worship music and spend some time worshiping him on the way to work. Whatever it is, I think we need practical steps today so we can be reminded of his presence in the midst of our wilderness. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we just come before you right now, and we're just thankful that you don't leave us to wander on our own, that you haven't gone ahead of us and you're waiting for us to catch up, but you're pursuing us and you are with us. And so I pray right now that in this moment, as we sit with you, that you would begin to shape and change us, that you would help us to leave here today with a plan to continue to stay in your presence each and every day. And that as we live our lives, that we would be a testament to other people of what it looks like to have your Spirit filling our lives. And as we trust you, Jesus, would you shape us and change us to be more like you? It's in your name I pray. Amen.